Hey, hello everyone. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be looking at um, the psychometric literature on how to construct or how to develop a latent construct or latent variable of something that is difficult to directly measure or observe. So we rely on other observables that we can combine together to create an index. So this will largely be looking at some of the methods developed by psychologists to develop these kinds of constructs that are typically used in psychology to measure things like personality traits, emotional states, attitudes, and abilities, things that are difficult to observe, but we have enough information, or we can collect enough direct information on individuals to kind of get a measure for some of these constructs, okay? So this video is going to be directly related to the lab that we'll be doing for this week, which essentially will give you practice to construct your own or to develop your own construct or latent variable, and also later on to look at the census data, community well-being survey from the census, and selecting some of the major census variables that you think are related to economic well-being at the community level. Okay, so this video will be very important for doing the lab. So make sure to pay close attention to this and keep it accessible in terms of for when you're doing the lab. Okay, so let me get my measurements here. Okay, so to begin with an example using poverty, we know that poverty, what poverty looks like, we can talk about it in using sentences to describe it, but it's actually a very elusive social science concept to measure directly. Of course, probably the most important direct measure we have is per capita income of the household or individual as our benchmark. And we can decide as a society anyone earning below a certain threshold would be considered in poverty. And that's in fact what we do to measure the poverty rate, looking at per capita income of a household. So if we're looking at Manhattan here, we'll kind of illustrate some of the problems with just using a poverty rate based on per capita income to describe the phenomenon of poverty. So example, we have a couple of different neighborhoods in Manhattan. We have Harlem that has registered anywhere between 40 and 80% poverty, people living below poverty line, whereas Chinatown, different part of Manhattan, but similar poverty rate. So on the surface, if we're talking about these two different communities, we can say, oh, they're both high poverty areas. But we can see with a little bit more discussion that this is a little bit too simple of a comparison. So we need to understand exactly what the poverty rate is and is not telling us. What are we measuring? What do we want to measure? And things like this. So we'll give a brief example. If we have 1% increase in population of people in poverty, in community A, we have the new level of poverty is 25%. Over a certain period of time, say a generation or 10 or 15 years, the 1% of new people moving into this community who are impoverished are then that 1% also is led out of poverty in over a generation, versus community B, where we have an influx of a much higher influx of poor individuals that come into a community that now has 25% individuals in poverty. But over a generation, those 20% that came in, over a generation, the 20% now has left poverty. So we can see that these two scenarios are quite different. And what we would explain this in terms of both communities have similar poverty rates of 25%, but the extent of poverty is totally different for these two communities. Of the 1% coming in impoverished over a generation, 1% of impoverished leaves poverty in the community A. So we would have 24% of chronic poverty, those who over a generation were born into poverty and stayed in poverty. Whereas in community B, we had a high influx of impoverished individuals coming to the community, but over a generation, the same 20% leaves poverty over a generation. So here, only 5% of community B population is what we would term as a chronic poverty, or has this problem of intergenerational poverty. Okay, so in Harlem, what we would say is, despite having similar poverty rate as Chinatown, the demographics of this impoverished community are typically individuals who are born into this area, and very few are able to leave poverty status. Whereas for Chinatown, we have a lot of very poor immigrants coming into the community. They may have few financial assets and low income, but they also have maybe stronger social capital. So their children and even themselves over a generation will have high economic mobility, where over time they're able to escape poverty. Okay, so despite having similar poverty rates, we can see in terms of battling poverty, it may be harder to deal with an intergenerational poverty or poverty trap, whereas compared to in another neighborhood like Chinatown. So this brings us into the question is, what is the poverty rate actually measuring? Is it an issue of lack of money? Is it lack of character, morals, lack of economic opportunity or access to amenities like healthcare and education? Are people unable to migrate out? In other country contexts, does it represent some kind of position in social group or caste system? So these are some of the questions that we want to ask. Is using the poverty rate based on a single economic indicator like the average wage, does that fully encompass what we mean when we think about the social science phenomena of poverty or living in poverty? So as a hypothetical or thought experiment, if you could define a federal measure of poverty, how would you create a meaningful construct or meaningful score to measure poverty? What type of poverty would your index be measuring? We definitely know there's a lot of different dimensions to poverty: financial, human, social, physical, access to public goods. And we can have some observables that we know, for financial, what their assets are, what their income is, human capital, what's their educational attainment, social capital, do they have any friends, local influencers like government officials, physical health, do they have a healthy regimen, a workout routine, access to parks, proximity to parks or libraries. So all of these different dimensions are themselves observable. And what the idea is in the psychometric literature to develop a new construct is that we would ideally have specific quantitative variables measuring these different dimensions, and then we combine them as our construct of poverty. Okay, so we have direct measures, like for instance, if you have the number of windshields installed by a factory worker, we can quantify that and count that. We have markers or predictors. So we have direct measures that serve as proxies for correlates that are harder to measure. So going back to our financial capital, this would be financial capital and human capital. This would be our markers or predictors of poverty, using direct measures like income or assets or educational attainment, and combining these predictors into a latent construct for poverty, or other kinds of popular constructs, especially in the psychometric literature, or things like testing intelligence using an IQ test, or depression or health status using survey information. Okay, so we have direct measures and latent constructs. The big thing that we're really interested in developing an instrument or a construct is how valid and reliable is that instrument. So if you're looking at something, you want to measure happiness, Again, it's a latent construct, meaning that we don't really have any true direct measure that we can quantify to distinguish happy from not happy individuals. So we need to use some kind of an instrument, which is typically some kind of questionnaire, survey data, to underline some kind of measurement for happiness. So in this case, a popular construct for happiness is the Oxford Happiness Questionnaire. Asks a bunch of questions using a Likert scale from 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly, or 1 to 6, strongly disagree to strongly agree. Asks a few questions for the respondents to fill in. For instance, I don't feel particularly pleased the way I am. I'm intensely interested in other people. I feel that life is very rewarding, and so forth. And you'll get a score for each question, and then you can combine the survey results to create a proxy, okay, for a latent construct. Other types of constructs, a good dancer, again, it's very difficult to observe a bunch of different individuals to determine who is a good dancer and who isn't. So you can construct or develop a survey instrument looking at a few different questions. So you can have things like other people would say I'm a good dancer, their motivation. So I am the first one on the dance floor. People have compared my dance moves to Drake, and I am athletic. So you could get answers to these questions, and from those answers form a construct using some kind of Likert scale. Again, 0 to 4, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so the question that we want to be very cautious of is, what's the validity of our instrument? Or in other words, how appropriate are the questions we're asking? Do they actually measure, or are they actually related to the construct we're trying to develop? So for these questions here, these items, do we think that they're going to be measuring the same kind of construct? That is, are they all very much related to indicating whether or not an individual is a good dancer or not? So the way that we typically look at how valid these constructs are is looking at their correlation structure with each other and seeing how closely related they are to each other, because not only is each survey question going to be related to hopefully related to the construct you want to develop, but they should also be related to each other. Okay, so people who think I'm a good dancer, they would also think that maybe my dance moves are good enough to be compared to Drake, who is arguably a very good dancer. So we would expect some of these questions to be highly related to each other. And as long as we have some intuition that at least one or more of these questions are definitely symbolic of the construct we're trying to measure of a good dancer, then we have some confidence that our construct will be valid. Okay, so when we go to the correlation structure for all the different variables, which we'll be learning to do in R, or relearning how to do, we can see the correlation structure between first on the dance floor and other people say I have good dance move as a correlation coefficient of 0.69, and moves like Drake and others say I'm a good dancer also has very high correlation of 0.88. Whereas I am athletic and others say I'm a good dancer, the correlation is pretty low, 0.011, and not significant related based on the Pearson correlation coefficient. So the question we want to ask are these 4 items or 4 questions, the responses to these questions, measuring the same thing? Okay, so there is a Cronbach alpha statistical measure developed by the in the psychometric literature, which is a measure of internal consistency or validity that is attempting to show us how closely related a set of individual items are as a group. Okay, and this is going to be our main statistic that we're going to use to reinforce our belief that the items or the questionnaires we've developed or the variables we're using are valid and reliable measure of our construct. Okay, so for instance, the way that it's set up is we have different levels of the Cronbach alpha score. So we have our alpha here, and we define the measure of reliability as being a combination of the product of the number of items and the average inter-item covariance. So each of the question you can calculate with respect to the other question, their inter-item covariance. And we're going to normalize this by the average variance within the item response plus n minus 1, and again standardized by the average inter-item covariance. And what this alpha score is going to be looking at is a score from 0 to 1. And we're going to have higher values being associated with a higher score or measure of reliability. And the standard rule of thumb is anything over 0.6 could be considered a reliable measure of the validity of the score. But obviously, the higher, the better. So in this case, when we look at these 4 questions related to whether or not an individual is a good dancer, the alpha is 0.68, which is decent. But one of the things that we can do when we have the survey questionnaire data is we can bring in a bunch of variables or a bunch of questions, and we can take out a bunch of variables, a bunch of questions. So it's kind of an art about selecting which questions or which items here, the combination is going to give us our biggest alpha, okay? So as we recall, there's some low correlation between athletic and some of the other variables. So what we might want to do is remove the athletic item question or the response to this question from our other variables, and then compute the formula for these 3 variables only. And when we do that, we have an alpha now that jumps up from 0.68 to 0.86. So we can see getting rid of this item from our construct increases our alpha and our confidence that these questions are all measuring the same thing, which we interpret as being whether or not a person's a good dancer. Okay, so we can do other kinds of constructs besides whether or not someone's a good dancer. So one thing that we would need a latent construct for is bro culture. We don't really have any direct observable or measure to determine what represents bro culture. We know some characteristics. The bro culture embodies things like self-entitlement, disregard for others, self-destructive behaviors, closed-mindedness, and strong group cohesion. And we can, if we wanted to deliver some kind of instrument to individuals, we can ask them a bunch of questions. So a few questions that some people have developed in psychology is related to beer pong, views on a beard, and preference for watching Family Guy. And we can see the individuals who love Family Guy and who love beer pong have a very high correlation coefficient, whereas people with views on beard and views on beer pong and Family Guy, a much lower correlation coefficient. So the main thing is we can draw in a bunch of these questions and again, develop this Likert scale from 1 to 5, in this case, strongly disagree to strongly agree, ask a set of questions that we hypothesize to be related to bro culture, and then get responses for each question. And again, apply the alpha score, develop the alpha score for these questions. But just looking at the correlation structure is very telling in terms of where the high correlations are between certain variables. And if we collect the survey data and we get all the responses to these questions and run our formula for our alpha, what these 6 questions involve, we get an alpha score of 0.16. So we can see that we have a very low alpha score, that we don't have much confidence that these 6 questions are measuring the same thing. So we need to go back to the correlation structure and start removing some of the variables that have very low correlation to the other variables. So for instance, beard, again, has relatively low correlation for most of the other variables. So we can get rid of the beards one and also Michael Jackson has a pretty low correlation to some of the other variables as well. So we can get rid of that guy as well. And we redo our formula for just these 4 remaining variables, and we improve our alpha score of 0.61. Okay. So this is kind of, again, the art of creating a valid score. We go back, we look at the correlation coefficient structure. We decide, okay, salmon is a fine color for shorts. Isn't highly related to some of the other questions, and we remove that, and now we've got an alpha score of 0.89. So we can see through repetition and playing around with the variables that we want to include in our calculation that we're going to get quite different alpha scores, and we want to optimize or maximize our alpha score so that we know based on our pre-existing assumptions for bro culture, we expect to have a strong affinity for playing beer pong at parties, maybe watching Family Guy, and SantaCon would be a great idea for a festival. So we assume that each one of these questions is related to some kind of dimension associated with bro culture, and they're also have confidence that these 3 questions are also very similar to one another. Okay, so just to give another example, more closely related to what we'll be doing, looking at the well-being of a local community. This slide is looking at the progress out of poverty index. So it's measure of poverty, a little bit more sophisticated measure than just using the per capita income to define a poverty status. But this index is developed at the progressoutofpoverty.org. And essentially, it's a simple survey or instrument, survey questionnaire to try to derive the well-being of an individual or of a household. The PPI is set up for 10 easy-to-answer questions. Typically takes about 5 to 10 minutes to answer. And the questions are quite straightforward and simple. For instance, what material is your roof made out of? How many of your children are in school? And they score the answers to provide the likelihood that a particular individual or household that lives below a certain poverty line, chances of moving out of that poverty over time. Okay, so they've developed this index for 45 different countries, and they've basically artificially imposed several stages based on what their responses have been. So looking at some Indian villages, for instance, they have 3 thresholds that they define in terms of households that are stages of poverty, of progress. So we have the first stage is in poverty, and this is obtained looking at combination of whether the household has basic food, some clothing, shelter, school enrollment, and ability to pay debts. We have a middle income status where households have some land improvements like irrigation. Maybe they started a household business or constructed a new house made of better materials. And then prosperous households, those that have disposable income to purchase goods like TV, electronics, or investments to increase productivity if you're a farmer, like a tractor, or increase their savings. Okay, so this is basically a brief theoretical overview of how we are able to use question surveys and question interviews to construct certain types of latent variables for things that are hard to directly measure, whether it's poverty, whether it's bro culture, whether someone's a good dancer or not. And what we're going to be doing now next is for the lab, we'll be using some census data from the ACS to try to pick a bunch of variables contained in the census that we think are a measure of community well-being. And you'll be tasked to pick a few variables from that list and try to optimize the alpha score that gives you the highest alpha score as a construct of community well-being. Okay, so tune in for the next video. We'll explain the lab a little bit closer.